The woman rode into Millfield, Kansas on a stolen horse, though nobody would prove that for another 3 days. Her dress was the color of prairie dust, tore at the hem from hard riding, and her dark hair hung loose beneath a man's hat that had seen better years. She moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to watch shadows and listen for the sound of pursuit, her green eyes scanning the main street with the wariness of a hunted animal seeking temporary shelter. The town of Millfield had grown up around the railroad tracks, like a prairie flower blooming beside a steel river, its wooden buildings weathered gray by the Kansas wind and sun. It was 1887, and the frontier was closing, but places like Millfield still operated by their own rules written in blood and enforced by men who believed that justice was whatever they said it was. Sheriff Ezra Blackwood watched her from a boardwalk outside his office, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with the practiced assessment of a man who'd made his reputation hunting down troublemakers. He was 42 years old, thin as a fence post, and mean as a rattlesnake with a toothache. The silver star on his vest gleamed in the afternoon sun, polished daily to remind everyone in town exactly who held the power of life and death. The woman dismounted outside Murphy's general store, her movement stiff with exhaustion and something else, pain, perhaps, or the kind of weariness that came from running too long and too hard. She tied her horse to the hitching post with hands that shook slightly, then stood for a moment gathering her strength before climbing the wooden steps to the store's entrance. Blackwood was already moving, his boots clicking against the boardwalk planks as he crossed the street with purposeful stride. "Hold it right there, missy," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Got some questions for you." The woman froze, one hand on the door handle, her shoulders tensing as if preparing to run or fight. When she turned to face him, Blackwood saw something in her eyes that made his hand drift instinctively toward his gun, not fear which he expected, but a kind of resigned defiance that spoke of someone who'd been cornered before and survived the experience. "Sheriff," she said, her voice husky with dust and fatigue, "I'm just looking to buy some supplies and be on my way." "That right?" Blackwood stepped closer, noting the way other townspeople were beginning to gather, drawn by the scent of trouble, like vultures to carrion. "Funny thing, got a telegram yesterday describing a woman matching your description. Woman wanted for murder up in Utah territory." The word murder spread to the gathering crowd like wildfire, whispered from mouth to mouth until it became a roar of righteous indignation. The woman's face went pale, but she didn't deny the accusation, and her silence was as damning as any confession in a court of frontier opinion. Within an hour, the woman was locked in Millfield's single jail cell, a cramped iron cage that held drunks, horse thieves, and the occasional murderer over the years. Her name, she'd finally admitted under Sheriff Blackwood's relentless questioning, was Catherine Kate Morrison, and the description on the wanted poster matched her perfectly, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow and the distinctive emerald ring she wore on her right hand. The telegram from Utah told a grim story. Kate Morrison was one of a shooting death of one Harrison Valdez, a wealthy rancher who'd been found dead in his study 3 weeks prior. The local marshal described her as armed and extremely dangerous, noting that she fled the scene before the body was discovered and had been spotted heading east toward Kansas. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Witnesses had seen her argue with Valdez the day before his death, and her sudden disappearance certainly suggested guilt. Sheriff Blackwood read the telegram aloud to the growing crowd gathered outside the jail, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. Harrison Valdez, shot twice in the chest with a .38 caliber revolver. Suspect fled on horseback, carrying stolen goods estimated at $500. He folded the paper carefully, his pale eyes scanning the faces of the townspeople. "Says here the reward is $200, dead or alive." The crowd's murmur grew louder, and Blackwood could hear the ugly undertone that always emerged when people smelled blood in the water. Millfield was a law-abiding town mostly, but like many frontier communities, it harbored a streak of vigilante justice that ran just beneath the surface of civilization. These were people who remembered the Indian raids, the cattle rustlers, and the desperados who plagued the territory in earlier years. They'd learned to be harsh because the land was harsh, and mercy was a luxury they couldn't always afford. "What you gonna do with her, Sheriff?" called out Tom Murphy, the store owner, his round face flushed with excitement. "Can't just let a murderer sit in jail eating our food." Blackwood smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Oh, I got plans for Miss Morrison. Territorial law says I can hold a summary trial for capital crimes when the evidence is clear and the danger to the community is immediate." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Trial set for sundown. If she's found guilty, and she will be, sentence will be carried out immediately." Inside the jail cell, Kate Morrison sat on a narrow cot with her head in her hands, listening to the crowd outside calling for her blood. She'd known this day would come eventually, had been running from her for 3 weeks, but hearing her death sentence announced so casually still sent a chill through her bones. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd finally stopped running only to find herself trapped in a place where justice was whatever the local sheriff decided it should be. Through the small barred window, she could see the carpenter already beginning work on a gallows in the town square, his hammer blows marking time like a funeral drum. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of blood and fire. She had perhaps 3 hours before the rope would be fitted around her neck. 3 hours to make peace with a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. But as she sat in that cramped cell, Kate Morrison wasn't thinking about dying. She was thinking about the truth, and wondering if anyone in this godforsaken town would care enough to hear it before they killed her. Jacob Thorne had been in Millfield for exactly 6 minutes when he heard about the hanging. He'd ridden in from his ranch 10 miles north of town to buy supplies and check his mail, the same trip he made every 2 weeks with clockwork regularity. At 38, Jacob was a man of habits and routines, shaped by 8 years of widowhood and the hard demands of running a cattle operation single-handed. His weathered face bore the permanent squint lines of someone who spent most of his time under the open sky, and his callous hands spoke of countless hours spent mending fences, breaking horses, and wrestling steers. He was not a man given to impulse or emotion, which made what happened next all the more remarkable. The crowd around the jail parted respectfully as Jacob approached, recognizing him as one of the area's more successful ranchers and a man whose word carried weight in the community. He'd built his reputation through hard work and fair dealing, never cheating a neighbor or backing down from a fight when principles were at stake. His late wife, Martha, had often said that Jacob Thorne was the kind of man the frontier needed. Tough enough to survive, but decent enough to build something worth surviving for. "What's all the commotion, Sheriff?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice. Blackwood puffed up like a peacock, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "Got ourselves a genuine murderess, Jacob. Woman rode in this afternoon. Matches a description on a wanted poster from Utah. Killed a man up there, stole his money, and came running to Kansas thinking she could hide among decent folk." Jacob's dark eyes moved to the jail window, where he caught a glimpse of a woman's pale face framed by iron bars. Something about her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned dignity, made him pause. "You said she matches a description. You certain it's the same woman?" "Course I'm certain," Blackwood snapped, irritated by the implied question about his competence. "Got her name, got her description, got her jewelry. Even got the horse she stole, though she claimed she bought it fair and square." The sheriff's laugh was harsh and grating. "Woman's a liar and a killer, and come sundown, she'll be dancing at the end of a rope." Jacob had seen enough hangings in his time, some justified, some not, and he'd learned to trust his instinct about people. Something about this situation felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. "Mind if I talk to her?" he asked, surprising himself with the request. Blackwood's pale eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What for? You planning to help her escape? Because if you are, I'm planning to satisfy my curiosity," Jacob interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that made several bystanders step back. "Last I checked, talking to a prisoner wasn't a crime in Kansas." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Finally, Blackwood shrugged and pulled out his keys. 5 minutes, he said grudgingly, "but I'll be watching every second." Jacob stepped into the jail's dim interior, his eyes adjusting to the gloom as he approached the cell. The woman, Kate Morrison, according to the sheriff, stood with her back to him, staring out the small window at the gallows being constructed in her honor. When she turned to face him, Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sight or sound. Kate Morrison was beautiful, but not in the soft, delicate way that frontier men usually admired. Her beauty was fierce and weathered, like a wildflower that had learned to bloom in rocky soil. Her green eyes held depths of pain and experience that spoke of a life lived hard and without apology, and the small scar above her eyebrow only served to make her face more interesting rather than less attractive. She was, Jacob realized, exactly the kind of woman his late wife Martha would have liked. Strong, independent, and unbroken by the harsh realities of frontier life. Come and get a look at the murderess before they string her up? Kate asked, her voice carrying a bitter edge that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. Seems to be the popular entertainment around here. Jacob studied her face carefully, noting the way she held herself despite her circumstances. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes clear and direct. This wasn't the posture of someone consumed by guilt or the desperate fear of a cornered criminal. This was someone who'd been falsely accused before and had learned to bear injustice with dignity. "Did you kill Harrison Valdez?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that the sheriff couldn't hear from outside. Kate's eyes flashed with something that might have been surprise or gratitude. "You're the first person to ask me that instead of just assuming I did," she said. "No, I didn't kill him. But I was there when he died, and I ran instead of staying to explain. Made me look guilty of sin, I suppose. Why did you run?" Jacob pressed, stepping closer to the bars. "Because Harrison Valdez was my husband," Kate said simply, the words dropping into the silence between them like stones into still water. "And because the man who actually killed him is the sheriff's brother, and I knew nobody would believe me over him." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow, reordering everything he thought he knew about the situation. "Your husband?" "Married 3 months ago," Kate confirmed, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I was Catherine Valdez for exactly 12 weeks before someone put 2 bullets in Harrison's chest and made me a widow and a fugitive." Jacob's mind raced, processing the implications of what she told him. If Kate was telling the truth, and every instinct he possessed said she was, then the real killer was not only free, but actively hunting her. The wanted poster, the reward, the rush to execute her without a proper trial. It all made sense if someone with authority was trying to silence a witness. "Can you prove any of this?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Not without going back to Utah, and I'd be dead before I made it halfway there," Kate replied. "Sheriff Valdez has connections throughout the territory. The telegram about me probably came from him." Through the window, Jacob could see the sun sinking lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The gallows was nearly complete, and the crowd was growing larger as word spread to the surrounding countryside. In less than 2 hours, an innocent woman would be hanged for a crime she didn't commit, unless someone found the courage to intervene. "What's your name?" Kate asked suddenly, studying his face with the same intensity he'd been using to study hers. "Jacob Thorne," he replied automatically. "I own the Double T Ranch north of town." Something shifted in Kate's expression, a flicker of hope that she tried desperately to suppress. "You're the one whose wife died of consumption 2 years back. People in town speak well of you, say you're an honest man." Jacob nodded, though the mention of Martha still brought a familiar ache to his chest. "I try to be." "Then maybe you'll believe me when I say I'm innocent," Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And maybe you'll understand why I can't just stand here and let them hang me for something I didn't do." Outside the jail, Sheriff Blackwood was checking his pocket watch with growing satisfaction. The sun was perhaps an hour from setting, and the crowd had swelled to nearly 200 people. Farmers, ranchers, merchants, and their families all gathered to witness what promised to be the most excitement Millfield had seen in months. The gallows stood ready in the town square, its noose swaying gently in the evening breeze like a grotesque pendulum marking the passage of time toward Kate Morrison's appointment with death. Jacob emerged from the jail with his mind racing and his conscience at war with his common sense. Everything Kate had told him had the ring of truth, but he had no way to prove her innocence before the sun set. Even if he could somehow delay the execution, Blackwood would never allow a proper investigation. The sheriff was clearly convinced of Kate's guilt, or perhaps simply eager to collect the reward money and the glory that came with capturing a wanted fugitive. Well, Blackwood asked, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Satisfied your curiosity? She confessed to anything interesting? She maintains her innocence, Jacob replied carefully, his voice giving nothing away. Says she was a victim's wife, not his killer. Blackwood's harsh laugh drew several chuckles from a nearby crowd. Course she does. They all claim to be innocent right up until the rope tightens. Woman's a liar and a killer, Jacob, and in about an hour she'll be a dead liar and killer. The casual cruelty in the sheriff's voice made Jacob's jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help Kate, and might only make her situation worse. He needed to think, to find some legal precedent or loophole that could save an innocent woman from judicial murder. That's when he remembered something Martha had told him years ago, a story about her grandmother who'd been saved from accusations of witchcraft by a quick-thinking suitor who'd claimed her as his wife. The territorial laws of Kansas were based on Old English common law, which included certain protections for married women. Protections that might apply even to accused criminals if the marriage was legal and properly witnessed. Sheriff, Jacob said slowly, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. I'd like to make Kate Morrison a proposition. Blackwood's eyebrows rose in surprise. What kind of proposition? The kind that requires a preacher and 2 witnesses, Jacob replied, his voice carrying a quiet determination that made several bystanders lean in to hear better. I want to marry her. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, drawing gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Blackwood's face went through several emotions, surprise, suspicion, and finally a cold rage that made his pale eyes glitter like chips of ice. You what? I want to marry Kate Morrison, Jacob repeated, his voice stronger now that he committed to the course of action. Right here, right now, before the execution. Are you out of your goddamn mind? Blackwood snarled, forgetting his usual careful language in front of the ladies present. She's a murderess, Jacob. You can't just marry a criminal and expect. I can marry anyone I choose, Jacob interrupted, his voice taking on a hard edge that his ranch hands knew meant he wouldn't be argued with. And according to territorial law, a married woman can't be executed without a formal trial and proper legal representation. Isn't that right, Reverend Phillips? The crowd turned to look at the elderly minister who'd been quietly observing proceedings from the edge of the gathering. Reverend Phillips was a learned man who'd studied law before answering the call to ministry, and his knowledge of legal precedent was well known throughout the community. The old man stroked his white beard thoughtfully, his eyes moving between Jacob and the jail where Kate waited. Well, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, the boy's not wrong about the law. The crowd erupted in heated debate as word of Jacob's proposal spread to the gathering like wildfire. Some call him a fool for wanting to marry a murderess, while others admired his courage in standing up to Sheriff Blackwood's rush to judgment. The women, particularly, seemed intrigued by the romantic drama unfolding before their eyes. A mysterious stranger saved from the gallows by a lonely rancher's proposal of marriage. It was the stuff of dime novels and frontier legends, the kind of story that would be told and retold around countless dinner tables for years to come. Sheriff Blackwood was furious. His pale face flushed red with anger as he realized that his carefully orchestrated execution was about to be derailed by a legal technicality. "This is ridiculous," he shouted over the noise of the crowd. "You can't marry a prisoner. There's got to be laws against that." "Actually," Reverend Phillips said mildly, consulting a small leather-bound book he produced from his coat pocket, "there's nothing in territorial law that prohibits marriage between consenting adults, regardless of their legal status at the time of the ceremony. As long as both parties are of sound mind and not already married, the union would be perfectly valid." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude toward the old preacher, whose careful study of legal precedent was proving invaluable. "And once she's married," he pressed, "she'd be entitled to proper legal representation and a formal trial, wouldn't she?" Reverend Phillips nodded gravely. "Indeed, the common law protection for married women are quite specific on that point. A wife cannot be executed for a capital crime without due process of law, including the right to legal counsel and the opportunity to present evidence in her defense." Blackwood's face was growing darker by the minute, and Jacob could see the sheriff's hand hovering near his gun. The situation was becoming dangerous, balanced on a knife's edge between law and vigilante justice. If Blackwood decided to ignore the legal niceties and proceed with the hanging anyway, there would be nothing Jacob could do to stop him short of drawing his own weapon, and that would likely result in a gunfight that would leave several people dead. "Bring her out," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. "Let's ask the lady what she thinks of my proposal." Blackwood hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He could refuse, but that would make him look like a tyrant in front of the entire community. He could proceed with the execution despite the legal complications, but Reverend Phillips's presence made that risky. The old preacher was well respected and would certainly report any violations of territorial law to the authorities in Topeka. Finally, with visible reluctance, the sheriff unlocked the jail door and gestured for Kate to come outside. She emerged blinking in the bright evening light. Her dust-stained dress wrinkled from hours in the cramped cell, but her bearing still proud and dignified. The crowd fell silent as she took in the scene, the completed gallows, the gathered townspeople, and Jacob standing in the center of it all with an expression of grim determination on his weathered face. "Miss Morrison," Jacob said formally, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that drew murmurs of approval from some of the watching women. "I've come to ask for your hand in marriage." Kate's green eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of mockery or cruel jest. When she found only sincerity and a quiet strength that reminded her of her late husband Harrison, she felt something shift in her chest. Not love, certainly, but recognition of honor and decency that had been absent from her life for far too long. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Because you're innocent," Jacob replied, his words causing another stir in the crowd. "And because no innocent woman should hang for a crime she didn't commit. Not while I have the power to prevent it." The impromptu wedding ceremony that followed would be talked about in Millfield for decades to come. Reverend Phillips, despite his advanced age and usual preference for carefully planned religious services, rose to the occasion with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to adapt to frontier conditions. He positioned himself between the bride and groom with his back to the gallows, as if symbolically blocking the path between Kate and her intended fate. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the unprecedented drama unfolding before their eyes. Jacob stood tall and straight, his hat in his hands and his dark eyes fixed on Kate's face with an intensity that made several women in the crowd sigh romantically. He was, they had to admit, a fine figure of man, strong, successful, and with the kind of quiet dignity that frontier women valued above flashy good looks or smooth words. Kate herself looked nothing like a traditional bride in her dust-stained traveling dress and tangled hair, but there was something undeniably moving about her situation that touched even the hardest hearts in the gathering. Sheriff Blackwood stood to one side, his face a mask of barely controlled fury as he watched his carefully planned execution transform into a wedding celebration. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Phillips began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent ministering to frontier communities, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words seemed to take on extra weight in the unusual circumstances, each phrase carrying implications that went far beyond the typical wedding ceremony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly or carelessly, but thoughtfully and reverently, with due consideration for the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Jacob found himself actually listening to the words rather than simply enduring them, struck by their relevance to his current situation. He was indeed entering into marriage thoughtfully and reverently, though perhaps not for the traditional reasons. His purpose was to save a life, to stand between an innocent woman and a corrupt system that would destroy her without a second thought. "Jacob Thorne," the preacher continued, "do you take Catherine Morrison to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Jacob's voice was steady as he answered, "I do." The words seemed to echo in the evening air, carrying away the commitment that surprised him with its intensity. He was promising to protect this woman, to stand by her through whatever trials lay ahead, and he meant every word despite having known her for less than an hour. Reverend Phillips turned to Kate, his aged eyes kind and understanding as he repeated the sacred vows. "Catherine Morrison, do you take Jacob Thorne to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Kate's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the hushed crowd. "I do." The simple words seemed to seal something more than just a marriage contract. They represented a leap of faith, a decision to trust her life to a man she'd just met, but who had already shown more honor and courage than most men she'd known in her 26 years. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas and Almighty God," Reverend Phillips declared, his voice ringing with satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and chaste, but it was witnessed by 200 people and legally binding under territorial law. As their lips touched, Kate Morrison became Kate Thorne, and with that simple change of name, she gained the legal protections that would save her life. Sheriff Blackwood's reaction to the completed marriage was swift and predictable. "This changes nothing," he snarled, his hand moving to his gun as he addressed the crowd. "She's still a wanted fugitive, still a murderess, and I still intend to see justice done." But Reverend Phillips stepped forward, his small leather-bound book still open in his hands. "Actually, Sheriff, it changes everything. Mrs. Thorne is now entitled to full legal representation and a proper trial. Any attempt to execute her without due process would be a violation of territorial law, and I'll be filing a report with the authorities in Topeka first thing tomorrow morning." The old preacher's words carried weight because everyone in the community knew his reputation for honesty and his connections with the territorial government. He'd been instrumental in establishing several Kansas towns and had personal relationships with judges and lawmakers throughout the territory. His threat to report Blackwood's actions wasn't idle. It was a promise that would almost certainly result in a formal investigation of the sheriff's conduct. Jacob placed his arm protectively around Kate's shoulders, feeling her trembling despite her outward composure. "My wife will be coming home with me tonight," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who wouldn't be argued with. "Tomorrow, we'll hire a proper lawyer and begin preparing her defense." "Like hell she will." Blackwood exploded, drawing his gun and pointing it directly at Jacob's chest. "She's a prisoner in my custody, and she's not going anywhere." The crowd gasped and stepped back, suddenly realizing that they were about to witness a gunfight in addition to a wedding. Jacob's hand moved slowly to his own weapon, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "you're pointing a gun at a law-abiding citizen and his wife. That's assault with a deadly weapon, and it's being witnessed by half the county. I suggest you holster that pistol before you do something you'll regret." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the two men staring at each other over the barrel of Blackwood's gun, while the crowd held its collective breath. Finally, it was Reverend Phillips who broke the tension by stepping between them, his aged but steady voice cutting through the silence like a sword. "Ezra Blackwood," he said sternly, using the full weight of his moral authority, "you put that gun away this instant. I've known you since you were a boy in Sunday school, and I won't stand by and watch you become a murderer yourself." The sheriff's hand wavered, his pale eyes darting between Jacob, Kate, and the preacher who baptized him 30 years earlier. Slowly, reluctantly, he holstered his weapon, but the rage in his expression promised that this wasn't over. "This ain't finished," he growled, addressing his words to Jacob, but including Kate in his baleful stare. "I'll be watching both of you, and the minute you step out of line, I'll be there." Jacob nodded calmly, though inside he was calculating distances and angles, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Sheriff. But for now, my wife and I are going home." He helped Kate into his wagon, noting how her hands shook as she climbed onto the seat beside him. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over but the gossip just beginning. By tomorrow, the story of the wedding at the gallows would be spreading throughout Kansas, growing more dramatic with each telling. The Double T Ranch sat in a valley 10 miles north of Millfield, its buildings arranged around a central courtyard that provided protection from both winter winds and summer heat. Jacob had built the ranch with his late wife Martha, choosing the location for its good water and natural windbreaks rather than its proximity to town. As they approached the house in the gathering darkness, Kate could see the care that had gone into its construction. Solid timber walls, a slate roof that would last for decades, and windows that spoke of prosperity and permanence. "It's beautiful," she said softly, the first word she'd spoken since leaving town. The simple statement seemed to release some of the tension that had built up during the silent ride, and Jacob felt his shoulders relax slightly. "Martha designed most of it," he replied, his voice carrying the familiar ache that came with speaking his late wife's name. She had strong opinions about what a proper home should look like. Kate nodded, understanding that she was entering a space that still belonged, in many ways, to another woman. The thought should have been uncomfortable, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. A man who honored his first wife's memory was likely to be someone who took marriage vows seriously, even when those vows were spoken under extraordinary circumstances. Jacob helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady and respectful as he guided her toward the house. "You'll have Martha's room," he said as they climbed the front steps. "I've been sleeping in the spare room since she passed. Didn't seem right somehow to stay in the bed we'd shared." The house's interior was clean, but obviously lacked a woman's touch. Functional furniture arranged for convenience rather than comfort, and absence of the small decorative touches that made a house feel like a home. Kate could see that Jacob had maintained everything carefully, but there was a sense of suspended animation about the place, as if time had stopped the day Martha died and never quite resumed its normal flow. "There's a bathtub upstairs," Jacob said, lighting an oil lamp and leading her toward the staircase. Water's heated by a boiler in the kitchen. Martha insisted on having the latest conveniences. "There's soap and towels in the washstand, and I'll bring up some of her clothes for you to wear. You're about the same size, I think." The kindness in his voice brought tears to Kate's eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. After 3 weeks of running, sleeping rough, and facing the constant threat of capture, the simple prospect of a hot bath and clean clothes seemed almost too good to be true. "Jacob," she said, stopping him as he reached for the lamp to light their way upstairs. "Why did you really do this? Save me, I mean. You don't know me, don't know if I'm telling the truth about being innocent. For all you know, I really am a murderess." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and deep pain. "Because 8 years ago, I stood by and watched my wife die of consumption, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to save her. Today, I had the chance to save someone else's life, and I took it. Maybe you're guilty, maybe you're not, but at least now you'll have a chance to prove your innocence. That's more than Sheriff Blackwood was willing to give you." Kate felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition. Jacob Thorne was the kind of man she thought no longer existed, honorable, brave, and willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. She'd married him to save her life, but she was beginning to suspect that he might save her soul as well. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying depths of meaning that seemed inadequate to express what she was feeling. Jacob nodded and continued up the stairs, leaving Kate to follow in the warm circle of lamplight, moving toward a future that neither of them could predict, but both were willing to face together.